For years, the world has watched the Braxton family navigate fame, heartbreak, and explosive emotions, but beneath the surface lies a deeper, more painful truth that has remained unspoken for far too long. The public has repeatedly labeled Tamar Braxton as dramatic, chaotic, loud, and unpredictable, often positioning her as a central problem in the Braxton family's turmoil. Yet Tamar herself has recently shifted that narrative, revealing a perspective that challenges everything fans thought they understood. She believes her behavior, her emotional struggles, and her public persona are deeply rooted in the upbringing she received from her mother, Evelyn Braxton. According to Tamar, the true source of her pain is not her personality, it is the environment she was shaped by. And when the pieces are examined closely, her claim holds more truth than many realize. Throughout her life, Tamar has faced relentless criticism. Online audiences accuse her of never taking accountability, of overreacting, of seeking attention. But Tamar insists that her intensity is not just a personality trait, it is a learned response, molded by the emotional landscape created by Evelyn Braxton during Tamar's formative years. Tamar grew up watching her mother hold on to bitterness, especially toward their father, Michael Braxton Sr., after his infidelity shattered their marriage. Instead of healing from that betrayal, the resentment stayed alive in Evelyn for over 2 decades, and Tamar saw that bitterness expressed openly, frequently, and passionately. She witnessed her mother's pain become a permanent part of her identity, something she clung to, rather than released. As a result, Tamar and her sisters absorbed that emotional rigidity and carried it into adulthood. The divorce between Evelyn and Michael was a defining trauma that reshaped the entire Braxton household. When Evelyn discovered Michael's infidelity, the heartbreak was devastating, but the emotional consequence went far beyond the end of their marriage. In the years that followed, Evelyn's anger and disappointment became the emotional climate her daughters lived in. Tamar often saw her mother speak sharply, hold grudges fiercely, and assert her authority without compromise. Evelyn's pain was real, but unresolved pain often transforms into a heavy force, one that influences everything around it. For Tamar, growing up meant learning that conflict was normal. Confrontation was a form of communication, and forgiveness was a luxury the family simply did not practice. Each Braxton sister responded to this environment differently. Tamar Braxton, the eldest, developed a composed, controlled exterior, calm on the surface, but quietly harboring her own emotional residue. Tracy Braxton, who maintained a relationship with their father, often felt judged for refusing to choose sides, creating long-standing friction between her and Evelyn. The other sisters navigated the emotional complexity with varying degrees of silence and restraint. But for Tamar, the emotional intensity was internalized more directly than anyone else. As the youngest, she was deeply attached to Evelyn, often seeking her approval in every decision she made. This closeness eventually turned into an emotional codependency. Tamar learned that agreeing with Evelyn kept the peace, while disagreeing with her triggered conflict. It was a subtle, but powerful control dynamic one Tamar didn't fully understand until adulthood. The public often interprets Tamar's reactions as immaturity or unnecessary dramatics, but her behavior is rooted in patterns she observed throughout her childhood. When Evelyn Braxton expressed anger, it was with passion and finality. When she felt wronged, she held the grudge long-term. When she believed she was right, there was no negotiating. Tamar absorbed these behaviors and reproduced them, not as performance, but as survival. This generational emotional blueprint shaped Tamar's identity, making her both expressive and defensive, loud and vulnerable. Strong yet deeply wounded, the ongoing tension between Evelyn and Michael Sr., even decades after their divorce, also contributed to the emotional fractures between the sisters. Instead of growing closer, their unresolved childhood wounds resurfaced in adulthood, creating distance where there should have been unity. Tamar has expressed that she often feels her sisters don't view her as an equal anymore, that their childhood closeness no longer exists. The emotional baggage they carried as children began influencing their relationships with one another. Tamar's outspokenness became an easy target, she said, what others refused to acknowledge, becoming the scapegoat for the family's unhealed pain. Despite her attempts at therapy, healing, and growth, Tamar's struggles remain visible because they were never only hers. She is not simply reacting to the conflicts in her present life, she is reacting to the emotional conditioning of her past. Tamar believes she inherited her mother's unhealed trauma, her mother's bitterness, and her mother's communication style. She has openly stated that she sees how Evelyn Braxton's unresolved anger toward Michael Sr. created emotional turbulence that shaped all of her daughters into women who struggle with vulnerability, forgiveness, and unity. The silent war between Tamar Braxton and Evelyn Braxton is not a loud, obvious battle. It is a quiet, lifelong conflict built on emotional dependency, generational pain, and expectations neither fully understood. Tamar's journey is one of a daughter trying to break patterns she never chose but inherited, while Evelyn struggles to acknowledge the long-term impact of her unresolved wounds. Their story is not simply a family conflict. It is an example of how trauma travels from one generation to the next, shaping identities and destroying relationships in the process. As the years went on, the emotional divide between Tamar Braxton and Evelyn Braxton deepened, not through open arguments, but through quiet tension that lingered behind every conversation and every televised appearance. Their conflict was never about a single disagreement. It was the accumulation of decades of unresolved pain. Tamar reached a point where she could no longer ignore the emotional weight she carried from childhood, and the public began noticing a shift in her tone. She was no longer just reacting. She was finally reflecting. For perhaps the first time in her life, Tamar started connecting the chaos in her adulthood to the emotional conditioning she grew up with, and she openly voiced that her mother's influence, though unintentional, had shaped her in ways she could no longer overlook. Tamar began to recognize patterns within herself that mirrored her mother's unresolved hurt. She saw how Evelyn Braxton's tendency to hold on to resentment had become a generational trait, silently absorbed by all the sisters. Whether it was Tony's quiet distance, Tracy's defensiveness, or Tamar's explosive reactions, the source of their emotional instability seemed to trace back to the same origin: a household built around a mother's heartbreak. The divorce between Evelyn and Michael Braxton Sr. never truly healed. It merely transferred its emotional debris onto everyone connected to it, particularly the daughters. Tamar often felt like she had inherited a grief that wasn't hers, yet it lived inside her as if it belonged to her from birth. What made Tamar's struggle even more painful was how she became the face of the family's dysfunction. Every time she reacted strongly on reality television, the public mocked her. Every time she expressed her pain, she was accused of being dramatic. But what the audience never saw was that Tamar was often reacting to emotions. She didn't fully understand emotions rooted in a mother who had spent decades trying and failing to let go of a betrayal that shattered her sense of trust and stability. Evelyn Braxton's pain was never simply hers. She carried it like a permanent part of her identity, and her daughters learned to internalize it as part of theirs. One of the most telling parts of Tamar's journey is her admission that she often felt emotionally policed by her mother. Whenever Tamar tried to express her own perspective or push back against something she disagreed with, Evelyn would shut it down quickly, framing her own viewpoint as the only correct one. As a child, Tamar complied. As a teenager, she resisted. As an adult, she fractured. That cycle of obedience, rebellion, and emotional collapse followed her well into her career. It became the foundation of her public persona: a woman fighting to be heard, fighting to defend herself, fighting to be understood, even when she wasn't fully sure what she was defending. The emotional control that Tamar felt from her mother wasn't always intentional. It was often the byproduct of Evelyn's own need to feel strong after feeling abandoned. But children raised in the shadow of unhealed trauma often mistake it for guidance. Tamar grew up believing that love and emotional dominance were intertwined. She believed that intense reactions were normal, that defensiveness was necessary, and that vulnerability was dangerous. These beliefs shaped her relationships, her friendships, her career, and even her self-worth. By the time Tamar reached adulthood, she was no longer just reacting to current situations. She was reacting to a lifetime of emotional teaching that she had never questioned. Meanwhile, the dynamic between the sisters continued to deteriorate. Toni Braxton distanced herself emotionally, protecting her peace at the cost of connection. Tracy Braxton, before her passing, struggled with feeling excluded and misunderstood. Tawanda and Trina carried their own silent frustrations. While the world saw a talented family with strong bonds, the reality behind the scenes was far more fractured. Tamar felt she was often blamed for the conflict because she was the only one who expressed her hurt openly. Her sisters, on the other hand, were more subtle, more reserved, and often frustrated by Tamar's intensity. But Tamar's emotional outbursts were not simply impulsive, they were the cry of someone raised to speak loudly, because that was the only way to survive in a house filled with unspoken resentment. As Tamar grew older and began working on her mental health, she slowly realized that she could no longer carry the emotional burden of protecting her family's image. She started acknowledging her own pain publicly, not to attack her mother, but to finally break the cycle that shaped her. When she pointed out Evelyn Braxton as a root of the family's emotional imbalance, it wasn't out of anger, it was out of clarity. Tamar had spent years blaming herself for the chaos around her, but when she stepped back, she finally saw the generational wounds for what they were. This realization didn't mean Tamar stopped loving her mother. In fact, it meant she was finally seeing her mother as a whole person, a woman who had been deeply hurt, who never fully healed and who unintentionally passed that hurt on to her daughters. The love without boundaries had cost Tamar her emotional stability. The silent war between Tamar and Evelyn was not a battle either of them wanted. It was the inevitable outcome of decades of unhealed trauma passed from one generation to the next. Today, Tamar's journey is one of reclamation. She is piecing together the parts of herself that were shaped by circumstances outside her control. She is learning to separate her identity from the emotional patterns she inherited. She is learning that expressing pain doesn't make her dramatic, it makes her human. She is learning that understanding her mother's wounds doesn't require inheriting them. And most importantly, she is learning that healing sometimes requires acknowledging the uncomfortable truth. The person who taught you strength is also the person who taught you pain. In the end, the story of Tamar Braxton and Evelyn Braxton is not about blame. It is about truth. It is about the quiet battles fought within families, the traumas carried unknowingly, and the courage it takes to break generational patterns. Their silent war was never one of hatred, it was one of hurt. And for the first time, Tamar is finally ready to speak her truth, not to expose her mother, but to free herself.